In this lesson, we will learn about nullable reference types in C#. Earlier in this course, we learned about reference types in .NET. Variables contain a reference to the data in memory. The variable contains the null value if it doesn't have a reference assigned. As we learned in a previous lesson about reference types, null values can lead to unexpected behavior such as null reference exceptions. Null reference exceptions are expensive because they usually lead to a crash in the application. That's why Microsoft introduced nullable reference types in C#10 and .NET 6 in November 2021. It's a notable new feature that we will explore in this lesson. Let's look at the following example. We have a person class with a name property. We create a new person object, assign the reference to the person1 variable, and write the name to the console. We also create a person2 variable of type person and assign null as its value. We also want to access the name property and write it to the console. As you can see, there are two compiler warnings. First, we see a warning on line 4 stating converting null literal or possible null value to non-nullable type. It means that we assign null to a type that is not intended to accept a null value. Second, we see a warning on line 5 stating dereference of a possibly null reference. It means that we possibly have a null value and trying to access a property on null will result in a null reference exception. Let's start the program. As you can see, the name of the person1 object is written in the console. However, the second write-line statement fails with a null reference exception. We cannot access the name property when the variable does not reference an object. Now, let's take a step back and look at the project setup. Remember, in the introduction of this lesson, I explained that nullable reference types were introduced with .NET 6. The warnings we see in the editor try to help us prevent the null reference exception. Let's open the project file. We see that the nullable property is set to enable. It means that the nullable reference types are enabled. As stated before, nullable reference types were introduced with .NET 6. Every project we create with .NET 6 or newer will have the nullable property enabled. Let's disable the property to see what it looks like without nullable reference types. Back in the program.cs file, we see that the compiler warnings aren't present anymore. It is what it looked like all the years before nullable reference types. Developers had to carefully write code and handle possible null references by checking the variables for null values before accessing their objects. Wouldn't it be great if we could decide whether a variable of a reference type should accept null values? Let's define a third person object and use the question mark after the type definition. It's the same syntax that we have learned for the nullable value types in the previous lesson. As you can see, we get a compiler warning stating that the annotation for nullable reference types should only be used in code within a nullable annotations context. It means that we can use nullable reference types only when they are enabled for the part of the code. It is possible to enable nullable reference types only for a specific part of the code. However, I suggest enabling them for an entire project. It makes the code a lot simpler to understand and maintain. Let's open the project file and enable the nullable property again. Back in the program.cs file, the error when creating the nullable reference type variable is gone. However, we now see different warnings. It is possible to treat compiler warnings as errors. In this case, we could add the warnings created by enabling the Nullable reference types feature to be treated as errors. It would turn the compiler warnings into compiler errors. It means that we force the developer to handle Nullable reference types properly, or the program will not compile. However, we continue working with warnings in this lesson. But we want to clean up the warnings by improving the code. First, let's define the type of the person2 object to be a Nullable reference type. We want to assign null, which means we need to turn the type into a Nullable reference type. Next, we need to resolve the warning when accessing the name property. Since the variable can be null, we need to check if the variable contains a reference to an object before accessing its name property. A simple option would be to compare the variable to null inside an if statement. If the person3 variable does not equal null, we print the name to the console. It resolved the error. However, null checks make the code bigger, and when you have many null checks, it also makes it less readable. With Nullable reference types, Microsoft introduced the null conditional operators. Let's get rid of the if statement and add a question mark after the variable. The warning is solved as well. The null conditional operator will check if the variable contains an object before accessing the name property. If the variable contains an object, the name property will be accessed and its value will be returned. However, when the variable contains null, the name property is not accessed and the null reference exception is prevented. However, in our case, the write-line statement will still be called with a null value, resulting in an empty line in the console. We can make that visible by adding another console write-line statement at the end of the program. Let's start the program to check the output. As you can see, the program does not crash even though we assign null to the person3 variable. The null conditional operator prevents accessing the name property and returns null, which results in an empty line in the console. Nullable reference types can be enabled per project and help developers prevent null reference exceptions. With enabled nullable reference types, we have to explicitly state when a reference type variable should accept a null value using the question mark after the type. Otherwise, the variable does not accept null. For projects created with .NET 6 or later, nullable reference types are enabled by default. For older projects, we can enable them using the nullable property in the project file. We can treat the warnings as errors, forcing developers to handle the possible null reference exception scenario, or they cannot compile the application.